Sergeant Rebecca Martinez stared down at the crumpled topographical map spread across the metal table in the Fort Braxton briefing room. Around her, 8 seasoned soldiers chuckled as she traced her finger along what appeared to be random squiggles and symbols she'd drawn across the North Carolina wilderness terrain. What they didn't know was that those seemingly meaningless marks would save their lives in less than 72 hours, when their routine training exercise would turn into something far more dangerous than anyone had anticipated. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning air hung thick with humidity as the 82nd Engineering Battalion prepared for what Command had labeled a standard navigation and resource procurement exercise. Rebecca Martinez, 26 years old and fresh from advanced cartography school, clutched her modified map against her chest as she approached the assembly point. The other soldiers were already gathered around Staff Sergeant Jake Morrison, their voices carrying across the training ground. "All right, ladies and gentlemen," Morrison barked, his weathered face scanning the group. "This is a 3-day field exercise. Your mission is simple. Navigate through the Whiskey Mountain Range, locate the designated supply drops, and rendezvous at Checkpoint Delta by 1800 hours on day 3. Rebecca shifted her weight from one boot to the other, feeling the weight of the additional equipment she'd packed. While her teammates had brought standard-issue gear, she'd spent the previous week studying satellite imagery, geological surveys, and historical land use reports. Her map looked nothing like the clean, regulation versions the others carried. "Martinez," Morrison's voice cut through her thoughts, "front and center with that map of yours." Rebecca stepped forward, unfolding her topographical chart on the portable table. Immediately, she heard Private Danny Kowalski snort with laughter. "What the hell is all that chicken scratch, Martinez?" Kowalski pointed at the dozens of small symbols Rebecca had penciled across the terrain. "Looks like someone let their kid draw all over a real map." Corporal Lisa Thompson leaned in closer, squinting at Rebecca's markings. "Are those triangles? And what are these little squares supposed to be?" "They're reference points," Rebecca said quietly, her voice barely audible over the growing murmur of amusement from her squadmates. "Reference points for what?" asked Private First Class Marcus Williams, grinning widely. "Secret treasure locations? Bigfoot sightings?" The laughter grew louder. Even Morrison cracked a smile as he examined the map more closely. Rebecca had marked over 40 different locations with various symbols: triangles, squares, circles, asterisks, and even some that looked like tiny trees. "Martinez, I appreciate your creativity," Morrison said, struggling to keep the amusement out of his voice. "But we're running a military exercise here, not a scavenger hunt. Maybe stick to the standard topographical markers next time." Rebecca felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment, but she didn't fold her map. "Sergeant, these markers indicate—" "They indicate you've been spending too much time in the library instead of the field," interrupted Specialist Amanda Rodriguez. "When we're out there dodging hypothetical enemy patrols, those little doodles aren't going to help us find water or shelter." The group erupted in fresh laughter. Private Kowalski made exaggerated gestures as if he were consulting an imaginary map. "Oh, look, guys, according to Martinez's treasure map, there should be a pot of gold right here." He pointed randomly at a tree. "Maybe she's marking all the spots where she wants to stop for a picnic," Thompson added, causing another wave of chuckles. Rebecca remained silent, but her grip on the map tightened. She'd spent countless hours researching the terrain they'd be crossing. The Whiskey Mountain Range was a 40,000-acre wilderness area that had been used for military training since the 1940s. What her squadmates didn't realize was that decades of previous exercises had left behind a hidden network of resources that weren't marked on any official maps. All right, settle down," Morrison said, though he was still smiling. "Martinez, you can bring your art project along if it makes you feel better, but don't slow down the group trying to decode your hieroglyphics." As the soldiers dispersed to gather their gear, Rebecca overheard Rodriguez talking to Williams. "I swear, some people think the Army is a summer camp," Rodriguez muttered. Wait until she realizes those fancy map-reading courses don't mean squat when you're actually humping it through the wilderness. Give her a break, Williams replied, though his tone suggested he wasn't entirely serious. Maybe she's onto something. Maybe there really are secret supply caches hidden all over these mountains, just waiting for someone smart enough to decode the ancient map mysteries. This sparked another round of laughter from the nearby soldiers. Rebecca pretended not to hear them as she secured her map in a waterproof case. She'd done her homework. The symbols on her map weren't random decorations or wishful thinking. Each one represented hours of research, cross-referencing declassified training reports, geological surveys, and even interviews with retired soldiers who'd trained in these mountains over the past 30 years. The triangles marked locations where previous units had reported finding natural windbreaks and shelter formations. The squares indicated spots where emergency supply drops had been staged during past exercises, many of which had never been fully recovered. The circles marked natural water sources that didn't appear on standard topographical maps, but had been documented in after-action reports from previous training missions. Most importantly, the asterisks marked locations where she'd identified patterns in the terrain that suggested man-made modifications, earthworks, cleared areas, and subtle elevation changes that indicated buried or camouflaged supply caches from decades of military exercises. As Rebecca shouldered her pack and prepared to move out with the group, she caught Morrison studying her map one more time. For just a moment, his expression seemed more curious than amused. "You really think those markings mean something, don't you?" he asked. "Yes, Sergeant, I do." Morrison folded the map and handed it back to her. "Well, I hope you're right, because if this exercise goes sideways and we need to live off the land, your little art project might be all we have." Neither of them knew how prophetic those words would prove to be. As the squad began their march into the Whiskey Mountain wilderness, Rebecca walked near the back of the formation, listening to her teammates continue their jokes about her treasure map. What they couldn't see was the confidence in her stride, the way she periodically checked her compass and GPS coordinates against the symbols on her chart. She knew something they didn't. Every single mark on that map represented a potential lifeline. And before their 3 days were up, they were going to need every single one of them. The squad had been hiking for 3 hours when the first radio crackled to life with static. Morrison held up his fist, signaling the group to halt as he adjusted his communications equipment. The dense canopy of pine and oak trees made radio contact spotty at best, but Command's voice came through in fragments. "Bravo team, weather advisory, severe storm system, approaching from the west." The transmission dissolved into white noise. Morrison tried several times to re-establish contact, his brow furrowing with each failed attempt. Rebecca noticed him glancing at the darkening clouds gathering on the horizon, though the morning had started clear and sunny.
"Probably just equipment malfunction," Specialist Rodriguez said, adjusting her pack straps. "These old radios are garbage in thick forest anyway." Private Kowalski kicked at a fallen branch. "Yeah, and Command always overcooks the weather reports. Remember that severe thunderstorm warning last month that turned out to be a light drizzle?" But Rebecca had been watching the atmospheric pressure readings on her altimeter, and they'd dropped significantly in the past hour. The wind patterns were shifting too, carrying the scent of rain from the western peaks. She pulled out her map and checked the first symbol she'd marked along their route, a triangle about 2 miles ahead. "Sergeant Morrison," she called out, "there's a natural shelter formation at grid reference 347521. If the weather does turn, it would provide good protection for the squad." Thompson rolled her eyes. "Here we go with the magic map again." "Martinez, we stick to the planned route," Morrison replied. "We've got a schedule to maintain, and I'm not going to start chasing your paper trail based on some clouds." The squad resumed their march through increasingly rough terrain. The established trail they'd been following began to deteriorate, forcing them to navigate around fallen trees and dense undergrowth. Rebecca noticed that several of her teammates were struggling with the heavier packs they'd brought for the 3-day exercise. Private Williams stumbled over a root system, nearly losing his balance under the weight of his gear. "Jesus, who planned this route? It's like they want us to break our necks out here." "Standard military trail," Morrison replied, though Rebecca could hear the concern in his voice. "Nothing we haven't handled before." But as they climbed higher into the mountains, the terrain became more challenging. The temperature was dropping faster than normal for the season, and the wind was picking up significantly. Rebecca checked her watch and compared their progress to the planned timeline. They were falling behind schedule, and the rough terrain was exhausting the squad faster than anticipated. "Sarge, my GPS is acting up," reported Corporal Thompson. "The signal keeps cutting in and out." Morrison checked his own GPS device and frowned. "Mine too. Must be atmospheric interference from the storm front."
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Rebecca knew it was more than that. The Whiskey Mountain Range had several areas where the terrain created natural GPS dead zones, something she'd discovered during her research. She'd marked these areas on her map with small X symbols, along with alternative navigation references. "There's a ridgeline about half a mile north that should give us better reception," she offered. "Martinez, for the last time, we're following the established route," Morrison said firmly. "Your little side trips aren't part of the mission plan." 20 minutes later, the first drops of rain began to fall. Within another 10 minutes, it had intensified into a steady downpour that soaked through their gear despite the waterproof coverings. The temperature continued to drop, and Rebecca could see her teammates beginning to shiver. "This isn't just a passing shower," Private Williams said, wiping water from his face. "This is turning into a real storm." The rain was making the rocky trail treacherous. Kowalski slipped twice on wet stones, and Rodriguez was having trouble maintaining her footing on the increasingly muddy path. Visibility was decreasing rapidly as the storm clouds thickened overhead. Morrison finally called a halt under a cluster of large pine trees that provided minimal shelter. "All right, we'll wait here for 30 minutes and see if this passes through." But Rebecca could see this was just the beginning. The storm system was massive, and they were walking directly into its path. She pulled out her map, now protected inside its waterproof case, and traced their current position to the nearest triangle symbol she'd marked. "Sergeant, we're about 300 yards from a natural rock formation that would provide real shelter," she said. "It's a box canyon with an overhang that could keep the entire squad dry." Rodriguez laughed bitterly. "Oh, great. Now she's a meteorologist, too. What's next, Martinez? Going to tell us you can predict earthquakes with your mystical map?" "The formation is documented in geological surveys from 1987, Rebecca continued, ignoring the sarcasm. "It was used as a staging area during the Cold War training exercises. There's even a small cave system that extends about 50 feet into the mountainside." "Documented where?" Thompson challenged. "I've never seen any reference to cave systems in this area on official maps." Rebecca reached into her pack and pulled out a laminated copy of a geological survey report. USGS documentation from the mineral survey conducted in the 1980s. The caves were noted but never marked on tactical maps because they weren't considered strategically relevant at the time. Morrison took the document and examined it briefly, rain dripping from the brim of his cap. The storm was intensifying, and several of his soldiers were starting to show signs of exposure. Williams was shaking noticeably, and Kowalski's lips were turning blue. "How do you know this stuff is still accurate?" Morrison asked. "Because rock formations don't change much over 40 years, Rebecca replied. "And because I cross-referenced the geological data with satellite imagery from last year. The formations are still there." A loud crack of thunder echoed across the mountains, followed immediately by a brilliant flash of lightning. The storm was directly overhead now, and the rain was coming down in sheets. The pine trees they were sheltering under provided almost no protection from the driving wind and water. "Screw it," Morrison said finally. "Martinez, lead the way, but if we get lost following your treasure map, it's on you." Rebecca nodded and pulled out her compass, checking it against the bearings she'd calculated. "Follow me and watch your footing. The terrain gets rocky." As she led the squad away from the established trail, she could hear murmured complaints behind her. "This is insane," Rodriguez muttered. "We're abandoning the mission plan to follow some weekend warrior's fantasy adventure. If she gets us lost out here, I'm going to use her map for toilet paper," Kowalski added. But Rebecca pressed forward, navigating by compass bearing and terrain features she'd memorized from her research. The rain made visibility poor, but she could make out the distinctive ridgeline that should lead them to the shelter. As they climbed over a series of large boulders, the rock formation began to come into view. "Holy shit," Williams whispered. Rising from the mountainside was exactly what Rebecca had described. A natural amphitheater carved into the rock face, with a deep overhang that extended nearly 20 feet from the cliff wall. Even more impressive was the dark opening of a cave system that disappeared into the mountain. "How did you know this was here?" Morrison asked, his voice filled with genuine amazement. "Research," Rebecca replied simply. "Lots and lots of research." The squad took shelter under the rock overhang, finally protected from the driving rain and wind. The temperature difference was immediately noticeable, and the soldiers began removing their soaked outer layers to prevent hypothermia. "This is incredible," Thompson admitted, looking around the natural shelter. "It's like a ready-made command post." Rebecca walked over to the cave opening and shined her flashlight inside. The beam revealed a tunnel that extended deep into the mountain, with evidence of previous human activity. Scorch marks from old campfires, carved initials in the rock, and even some rusted metal objects that looked like they might be military surplus. "There's more," she said. According to the historical records, this site was used as a supply cache during training exercises in the 1960s and 70s. Some of that equipment might still be here. Morrison joined her at the cave entrance. What kind of equipment? "Emergency rations, medical supplies, communication equipment, cold weather gear," Rebecca recited. "Stuff that was pre-positioned for training scenarios but never fully recovered when the exercises ended." Kowalski, who had stopped shivering now that he was out of the storm, looked at Rebecca with new interest. "You mean there might actually be supplies hidden in these mountains?" "Not hidden," Rebecca corrected. "Forgotten. There's a difference." As the storm continued to rage outside their shelter, Morrison studied Rebecca's map more carefully. For the first time, he began to see her symbols not as random markings, but as a carefully researched catalog of resources and tactical advantages. "Martinez," he said quietly, "how many of these sites did you identify?" Rebecca looked at her map, counting the various symbols scattered across the terrain they'd be crossing over the next 2 days. 47 confirmed locations: shelter sites, water sources, potential supply caches, communication high points, and emergency extraction zones. The other soldiers had grown quiet, listening to their conversation. Outside, lightning flashed again, illuminating the storm that showed no signs of letting up anytime soon. Morrison realized that their routine training exercise had just become something very different. And Rebecca Martinez, with her carefully annotated map, might be the only thing standing between his squad and a serious survival situation. "Tell me about the rest of these markings," he said. "All of them." For the first time since the exercise began, nobody was laughing at Rebecca's map.
Rebecca traced her finger across the map, stopping at each symbol as she explained its significance to the squad huddled around her in the cave. The storm outside had intensified into what meteorologists would later classify as a derecho, a widespread, long-lived windstorm with hurricane-force gusts. "These asterisks mark confirmed supply cache locations," she began, pointing to 6 star-shaped symbols scattered across their planned route. "I cross-referenced BAFTA action reports from exercises dating back to 1962 with current satellite imagery. Most of these sites show subtle ground disturbances consistent with buried storage containers." Morrison studied the map intently. "How confident are you in these locations?" 90% for the asterisks, 75% for the squares," Rebecca replied. "I found multiple independent references for the asterisks in different military databases. The squares are based on terrain analysis and historical patterns, so they're more speculative."
Private Williams had ventured deeper into the cave system and returned with something that made everyone's eyes widen: a military-issue ammo can, still sealed with what appeared to be original packing tape from decades ago. "Found this about 30 feet back," he announced, setting the green metal container on the cave floor. "There are at least 4 more just like it." Morrison examined the container's markings. "Property of U.S. Army, dated 1973. Should we open it?" Rebecca nodded. The historical records indicate these caves were used for long-term storage during extended training operations. Whatever's inside should still be viable. They pried open the container to reveal perfectly preserved emergency rations, water purification tablets, first aid supplies, and something unexpected: detailed topographical maps from the 1970s showing military installations and supply points that no longer appeared on modern charts. "Jesus Christ," Kowalski breathed, examining the vintage maps. "These show stuff that's not on any current documentation." Rebecca compared the old maps to her annotated version. "Look at this," she said, pointing to several locations where the vintage maps showed supply depot symbols. "These match exactly with some of my asterisk markings. The military was using the same strategic locations 40 years ago." But their discovery was interrupted by Morrison's radio crackling back to life. This time, the transmission was crystal clear and alarming. All units, this is command. Flash flood warning is now in effect for the entire Whiskey Mountain Range. Heavy rainfall has caused catastrophic overflow of Henderson Creek and Millbrook Dam. All personnel are ordered to move to high ground immediately and await extraction." The radio fell silent again, but the message was unmistakable. Their training exercise had become a genuine emergency situation. "Millbrook Dam," Rodriguez said, her voice tight with concern. "That's upstream from our planned route. If it's overflowing—" Rebecca was already studying the topographical contours on her map. "Our designated rendezvous point at Checkpoint Delta is in a valley bottom. If there's flooding, it'll be completely underwater within hours." Morrison grabbed the radio and tried to respond, but got only static. "We're on our own," he said grimly. "Martinez, what's our best option for high ground?" Rebecca had been preparing for this exact scenario. She pointed to a series of circles she'd marked on the eastern ridgeline. "These locations are all above 2,800 feet elevation, well clear of any potential flood zones. But more importantly, 2 of them are former helicopter landing zones from Cold War exercises. If Command sends extraction teams, those are the most logical pickup points." "How do you know about helicopter landing zones from the Cold War?" Thompson asked. Rebecca reached into her pack and pulled out another laminated document. "Declassified training records from the 82nd Airborne, archived at Fort Liberty. I requested them through the Freedom of Information Act 6 months ago." The squad stared at her. 6 months ago meant she'd been researching this terrain long before she even knew she'd be training here. "Martinez," Morrison said slowly, "exactly how much preparation did you do for this exercise?" "About 200 hours of research over the past year," she replied matter-of-factly. "I've been studying historical military land use patterns across the southeastern United States as part of my graduate thesis. This region is one of the most extensively documented training areas in Army history." Williams laughed, but this time it wasn't mocking. "You're telling me you wrote a college paper about these mountains?" "Specifically about resource management and strategic asset placement in long-term military training environments," Rebecca corrected. "The paper won't be finished for another 6 months, but the research phase is complete." Outside, a rumbling sound echoed across the mountains, not thunder, but something more ominous and sustained. Morrison recognized it immediately. "That's water," he said. "A lot of water is moving fast." Rebecca checked her altimeter and compass readings. "We need to move now. The floodwaters will funnel through the valley systems and cut off our escape routes if we wait too long." She led them out of the cave into the still raging storm. The rain was horizontal now, driven by winds that Rebecca estimated at over 60 miles per hour. But she navigated confidently, following terrain features that weren't obvious to the others. "Stay close and watch for loose rocks," she called back over the wind.
We're heading for the ridgeline, but we need to take the long route around the avalanche zone. What avalanche zone? Rodriguez shouted. Rebecca pointed to a series of small triangular symbols on her map. Geological Survey identified 17 potential rockslide areas in this region. I marked them all. The direct route to high ground goes right through the worst one. As they climbed through the storm, following Rebecca's carefully planned route, the sound of rushing water grew louder. Through breaks in the forest, they could see muddy torrents where dry creek beds had been hours ago. "Holy shit," Kowalski said, staring at a raging river that hadn't existed on their morning hike. "At least," Rebecca agreed, "and it's moving fast enough to knock a person off their feet. This is why we had to go around." They reached the first high ground position as the storm began to show signs of weakening. From their vantage point, 3,200 feet above sea level, they could see the extent of the flooding below. Entire sections of the valley were underwater, including the trail they'd been following and their original rendezvous point. "We would have been trapped down there," Morrison said quietly, studying the scene through his binoculars. Rebecca checked her map and pointed to another symbol about 2 miles north. "The primary extraction site is over there, a natural clearing that was used as a helicopter pad during the 1980s. It should still be accessible and well above the flood line." But as they prepared to continue their climb, Rodriguez made a disturbing discovery. Her pack had been damaged during their scramble up the mountains, and most of her emergency rations had been lost. Williams and Kowalski reported similar problems. Their food supplies were either damaged or completely gone. "We've got maybe 1 day's worth of rations left between all of us," Morrison assessed grimly. "And extraction could take anywhere from hours to days depending on weather and logistics." Rebecca smiled for the first time the exercise began. She opened her map to show them a cluster of asterisk and square symbols scattered across the high ridge system. "According to my research, there are at least 12 supply caches within a 3-mile radius of the extraction site. Most date from the 1960s, but a few are more recent, from training exercises in the 1990s.
You're talking about food that's been buried in the mountains for 30 years? Thompson said skeptically. Even military rations don't last that long. MREs have a shelf life of up to 25 years under proper storage conditions, Rebecca replied. And the older sea rations in sealed containers can remain edible for decades. I've documented cases of World War II supplies being recovered in excellent condition after 60 years. Morrison was beginning to understand the true scope of what Rebecca had accomplished. You didn't just research this area, you created a comprehensive survival resource database. Exactly, she confirmed. Every symbol on this map represents a verified resource that could be vital in an emergency situation. Water sources, shelter, food, equipment, communication points, extraction zones, hazard areas, everything a squad would need to survive and complete their mission regardless of circumstances. As they set up a temporary camp in the shelter of some large boulders, Morrison radioed their status to command. This time, the transmission went through clearly. "Command, this is Bravo Team. We're at grid reference 389-447, approximately 3,200 feet elevation, safe from flood conditions and ready for extraction." "Copy, Bravo Team. Weather conditions are preventing immediate extraction. Maintain current position. Extraction window estimated 18 to 36 hours from now." Morrison looked at his depleted, exhausted squad, and then at Rebecca's map with its dozens of carefully researched symbols. "Martinez," he said, "I think it's time we stopped treating your map like a curiosity and started treating it like what it really is." "Which is?" she asked. "A masterpiece of military intelligence that just might save all our lives." For the first time since they'd known her, Rebecca Martinez looked genuinely proud. And for the first time since the exercise began, the rest of the squad was looking at her with something approaching awe. The next morning brought clear skies, but revealed the true devastation of the storm. From their elevated position, the squad could see that entire sections of the mountain valley had been reshaped by the flooding. Trees that had stood for decades were now scattered like matchsticks, and the landscape looked alien compared to their maps from just 24 hours earlier. Morrison's radio crackled with an update from command. Bravo team, be advised that the primary extraction point is compromised due to ground saturation. The secondary extraction site is also flooded. We're working to identify alternative pickup zones. Maintain current position and conserve resources. The message was clear. They were going to be out here longer than anyone had planned, and their already limited food supplies were about to become critical. "All right, Martinez," Morrison said, folding up his radio. "Time to put your research to the test. Where's the nearest supply cache?" Rebecca consulted her map and compass, taking bearings on several distant peaks to confirm their exact position. "There's an asterisk location about 800 meters northwest of here. According to the 1967 after-action report from Operation Mountain Thunder, it should contain a buried supply container with rations for 12 soldiers for 5 days. "Should contain?" Rodriguez asked. "What if it's been found already? What if animals got to it? What if the whole thing is just wrong?" Rebecca had anticipated these concerns. "That's why I identified multiple cache sites in overlapping coverage areas. If one location is compromised, we have backups. The nearest cluster has 7 potential sites within a 2-mile radius." As they prepared to search for the first cache, Kowalski raised another practical question. "How exactly are we supposed to find a buried container that's been underground for 50 years? Do we just start digging random holes?" Rebecca smiled and pulled out what looked like a modified metal detector from her pack. "Surplus military electronics detector, calibrated for ferrous metals at depths up to 6 feet. I bought it at a surplus store and modified the sensitivity settings." Williams stared at the device. "You brought a treasure-hunting metal detector on a military training exercise?" "I brought a resource recovery tool," Rebecca corrected. The hike to the first cache location took them through terrain that had been dramatically altered by the storm. Several times they had to detour around washouts or newly formed ravines, but Rebecca navigated confidently using her compass and the distinctive rock formations she'd memorized from satellite images. The original cache was positioned to take advantage of natural landmarks that wouldn't change over time. Even if vegetation grows or weather patterns change, the underlying rock formations remain constant. When they reached the area marked by her first asterisk, Rebecca began methodically sweeping the metal detector across the ground. The device remained silent for the first 10 minutes, but then began emitting the steady beeping that indicated buried metal. "Got something," she announced, marking the spot with a stick. The signal strong and consistent, about 4 feet down. The squad took turns digging, using their entrenching tools to excavate what turned out to be a perfectly preserved military supply container, vacuum-sealed and wrapped in multiple layers of waterproof material. Inside, they found exactly what Rebecca had predicted: dozens of military ration packs, water purification supplies, basic medical equipment, and even cold-weather clothing still in original packaging. "This is unreal," Thompson said, examining a ration pack dated 1969 that looked like it had been manufactured yesterday. "How did you know it would be preserved this well?" "Proper military storage protocols," Rebecca explained. "These containers were designed for long-term deployment scenarios. The Army knew they might need to recover supplies years later, so they used preservation methods that could withstand decades of environmental exposure." But the discovery raised a new question that made Morrison think strategically. "Martinez, if you can locate one cache this accurately, what else might be out there? Are we talking about just food and basic supplies, or did they bury other types of equipment too?" Rebecca's expression grew more serious. "Communications equipment, weapons, ammunition, vehicle parts, fuel containers, engineering tools, medical supplies beyond basic first aid. Essentially everything needed to support extended military operations in hostile territory." The implications were staggering. What Rebecca had discovered wasn't just a collection of forgotten supply drops. It was evidence of a massive, decades-long military logistics operation that had left behind a hidden infrastructure across the entire mountain range. "How much of this stuff is out there?" Williams asked. Rebecca consulted her map, counting symbols. "Based on my research, I've identified potential cache sites containing approximately $40,000 worth of military equipment and supplies scattered across this region. Most of it has been sitting undisturbed for 20 to 50 years.
Morrison was quiet for a long moment, processing what this meant. "Martinez,
Do you realize what you've actually discovered here? This isn't just research for a college paper. This is actionable military intelligence about strategic assets that Command probably doesn't even know exist anymore. Rebecca nodded slowly. I know. That's why I brought the metal detector. And that's why I've been documenting everything with GPS coordinates and photographic evidence. Someone needs to create an official record of these resources before they're completely forgotten. As they redistributed the recovered supplies among their packs, Rodriguez made an observation that changed the entire dynamic of their situation. You know what's crazy about this? We went from being barely able to complete a standard training exercise to having better field intelligence than most special forces units get for actual combat deployments. That's not an accident, Rebecca replied. Modern military logistics assume real-time supply chain management and constant communication with command. But what happens when those systems fail? What happens when you're cut off and have to rely on local resources? The military learned these lessons decades ago, but somehow the institutional knowledge got lost. Morrison was beginning to see the bigger picture. You're saying the Army used to be better at this kind of long-term strategic planning? Much better, Rebecca confirmed. During the Cold War, every major training area in the United States had pre-positioned supply networks designed to support guerrilla operations or resistance movements. The assumption was that conventional supply lines might be compromised, so local cache systems were essential for mission continuity. As they prepared to move toward the extraction site, Morrison made a decision that surprised everyone. Instead of taking the direct route, he asked Rebecca to guide them past 2 more cache locations. If we're going to be out here another day or two, we might as well see what else your research can turn up, he explained. And frankly, I'm curious to see how accurate your other predictions are. The second cache site yielded communications equipment from the 1980s, including shortwave radios that still functioned perfectly after being sealed in storage for 40 years. The third site contained cold weather gear and survival equipment that was more advanced than what the squad had been issued for their training exercise. This is better equipment than what we're carrying, Kowalski observed, examining a sleeping bag that was rated for temperatures 20 degrees colder than their standard issue gear. Military technology improved rapidly during the 1970s and 80s, Rebecca explained. A lot of the equipment that was considered cutting-edge then got replaced by newer systems, but the old stuff was often better built and more durable than what we use today. By late afternoon, they had recovered enough supplies and equipment to sustain a full platoon for weeks. More importantly, Morrison realized that Rebecca's research had transformed their understanding of the entire training area. Martinez, he said as they set up camp near the extraction site, I need you to walk me through your complete research methodology, all of it. How did you find these locations? What other resources did you identify? And most importantly, how can we replicate this process for other training areas? Rebecca spread out her map and pulled out a thick folder of supporting documents. It started with historical research, military records, geological surveys, land use studies, satellite imagery analysis, and interviews with retired personnel who trained in these areas. Then I used geographic information systems to correlate the historical data with current topographical information. She showed him database printouts, annotated satellite photos, and correspondence with military historians and retired officers who had shared their memories of training exercises from decades past. The key was realizing that military logistics have been using the same strategic principles for resource placement for generations: high ground for communications, natural shelter for protection, water sources for sustainability, and concealment for security. Once you understand the principles, you can predict where supplies would be positioned even without specific documentation. Morrison studied her research materials with growing amazement. You reverse-engineered 50 years of military logistics planning? Exactly, Rebecca said. And the best part is, this methodology could be applied to any military training area in the United States. There are probably thousands of forgotten cache sites scattered across bases and training grounds that could be recovered and reactivated. As the sun set on their second day in the mountains, Morrison looked at his squad, well-fed, properly equipped, and secure in their position thanks entirely to one soldier's extraordinary preparation and research. Martinez, he said,
When we get back to base, you and I are going to have a very serious conversation with Command about your research project. Rebecca looked up from her map where she was already planning her route to additional cache sites they could investigate during their remaining time in the field. Yes, Sergeant, I was hoping you'd say that. The third morning brought the distant sound of helicopter rotors echoing across the mountain peaks. Morrison's radio confirmed what they were hearing. Extraction was finally possible, with multiple aircraft inbound to evacuate personnel from various locations across the flood zone. Bravo team, this is Extraction Command. We have 2 UH-60s en route to your coordinates. Estimated arrival time, 45 minutes. Prepare for immediate departure upon arrival. But as the squad gathered their gear and prepared for pickup, an unexpected transmission changed everything. All units, this is General Patterson. I want the squad leader responsible for the intelligence reports filed yesterday to remain on site for extended debriefing. All other personnel will return to base as scheduled. Morrison looked confused. I didn't file any intelligence reports yesterday. Rebecca raised her hand quietly. I did, Sergeant. During the radio check last night, I transmitted a preliminary assessment of discovered resources to the Intelligence Division. Standard procedure for field discoveries of potential strategic value. The squad stared at her. Rodriguez was the first to speak. You filed an official intelligence report? About what? About the cache network, Rebecca replied, and about the implications for military resource management across all training facilities. The report included GPS coordinates, estimated asset values, and recommendations for systematic recovery operations. Williams laughed in disbelief. Martinez, you just turned our training exercise into a Pentagon briefing? But Morrison was beginning to understand the magnitude of what was happening. Rebecca, who exactly did you send that report to? She consulted her notebook, flipping to a page filled with radio frequencies and call signs. Defense Intelligence Agency, Strategic Resources Division, Training Command Logistics, and the Office of the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Special Operations. Standard distribution for field intelligence regarding strategic assets. Kowalski's jaw dropped. Do you have direct communication protocols with the Pentagon? I have a security clearance for my graduate research, Rebecca explained. My thesis advisor is a retired general who sits on the Defense Science Board. When I started discovering evidence of undocumented military assets, he helped me establish proper reporting channels.
Thompson shook her head slowly. So, when we thought you were just some overeager college student with a hobby, you were actually conducting an official military intelligence operation? Unofficial, Rebecca corrected. My research was personal academic work until yesterday, when the discoveries became operationally relevant. That's when it became necessary to activate formal reporting protocols. The sound of approaching helicopters grew louder, but Morrison realized they were dealing with something far more complex than a simple training exercise extraction. Martinez, level with me, he said seriously. What exactly have you gotten us involved in here? Rebecca looked at her map one final time, then folded it carefully. Sergeant, based on my research across 17 military installations in the southeastern United States, I estimate there are approximately 1,200 undocumented cache sites containing strategic assets worth between $15 and $20 million. Most of this equipment has been sitting unused for 20 to 50 years, much of it in better condition than current standard-issue gear. The helicopters were circling overhead now, preparing to land in the extraction clearing, but Morrison held up his hand, signaling them to continue their conversation. You're talking about enough equipment to outfit multiple divisions, Morrison said, or to supply resistance operations across an entire geographic region, Rebecca added, which was the original strategic purpose. During the Cold War, military planners assumed that conventional forces might need to operate without traditional supply lines for extended periods. These cache networks were designed to support that capability. Rodriguez asked the question everyone was thinking, why doesn't Command know about this stuff? Institutional memory loss, Rebecca replied. The officers who planned these operations retired or transferred. Record-keeping systems changed. Priorities shifted to different strategic concerns. Over time, the locations were simply forgotten. As the first helicopter touched down, a figure in dress uniform climbed out instead of the expected flight crew. Morrison recognized the rank insignia immediately. Lieutenant Colonel. "Which one of you is Specialist Martinez?" the officer called out over the rotor noise. Rebecca stepped forward. "That's me, sir." The lieutenant colonel approached, carrying a briefcase and looking extremely serious. "I'm Lieutenant Colonel James Harrison, Defense Intelligence Agency. I need to speak with you immediately about your intelligence report." Morrison felt suddenly protective of his soldier. "Sir, Specialist Martinez has been conducting herself exemplarily throughout this exercise. Whatever questions you have—" "Sergeant, this isn't about disciplinary action," Harrison interrupted. "This is about strategic resource recovery on a scale we haven't seen since World War II. Specialist Martinez may have just solved one of the biggest logistics challenges facing modern military operations." Rebecca looked uncertain for the first time since Morrison had known her. "Sir, I was just documenting forgotten supply sites. I didn't realize the implications would be this significant." Harrison opened his briefcase and pulled out satellite photographs, military records, and what appeared to be a thick operational briefing document. "Specialist, your research methodology has identified resource networks that our best intelligence analysts missed for decades. More importantly, you've demonstrated that this systematic approach could be replicated across every major training facility in the United States." He spread the documents on a nearby rock, showing aerial photographs of cache sites that had been successfully located using Rebecca's methods. "Based on your preliminary report, we've already dispatched recovery teams to 3 other installations. They've confirmed the existence of substantial equipment stockpiles at all 3 locations." Morrison realized that Rebecca's academic research had accidentally uncovered a national security asset of enormous strategic value. "What happens now?" he asked. Harrison looked at Rebecca directly. "Specialist Martinez, you're being offered immediate reassignment to a joint task force focused on strategic resource recovery operations. Your mission would be to systematically identify and catalog forgotten military assets across all domestic training facilities." The offer hung in the air as the second helicopter circled overhead, waiting for landing clearance. "What about my current unit?" Rebecca asked. "What about finishing my graduate degree?" "Your unit will be commended for supporting this discovery," Harrison replied, "and the Army will provide full support for completing your academic work. In fact, your thesis research is now classified as strategically relevant to national defense." Rodriguez stepped forward. "Sir, what about the rest of us? We helped locate these things too." Harrison smiled for the first time since arriving. "Sergeant Morrison, your squad is being recommended for commendation for exceptional performance under emergency conditions. More specifically, you're being offered the opportunity to form the core team for the new Strategic Resource Recovery Unit." Morrison looked at his soldiers, the same team that had been joking about Rebecca's treasure map just 3 days earlier. Now they were being offered positions in what sounded like a completely new type of military operation. "All of us?" Williams asked. "All of you," Harrison confirmed. "This type of work requires soldiers who can think creatively, adapt to unexpected situations, and work effectively with unconventional intelligence sources. Based on your performance over the past 3 days, you've demonstrated exactly those capabilities." As Rebecca prepared to board the first helicopter with Lieutenant Colonel Harrison, Morrison stopped her. "Martinez," he said, "I owe you an apology. We all do. You weren't just prepared for this exercise, you were prepared for something we didn't even know existed." Rebecca smiled and held up her carefully annotated map. "Sergeant, I was never trying to prove anything to anyone. I was just trying to make sure we'd be ready for whatever happened out here." She looked at her map one more time, then handed it to Morrison. "You might want to hold on to this. Something tells me we're going to need it for the next mission." As the helicopters lift off from the mountain clearing, carrying the squad toward a future none of them had imagined 3 days earlier, Morrison realized that sometimes the most important discoveries come from people who are willing to look at old problems in completely new ways. Rebecca Martinez had started with a simple question about resource management in military training environments. She was ending with the discovery of a hidden national security asset worth millions of dollars and a completely new approach to military logistics planning. And it all began with a map that everyone thought was just covered in meaningless squiggles. 6 months after the flood turned discovery in the Whiskey Mountains, Rebecca Martinez stood in a Pentagon briefing room facing an audience that included 2 generals, representatives from 5 different military branches, and officials from the Defense Intelligence Agency. On the wall behind her, a massive digital map displayed hundreds of red dots across the continental United States, each one representing a verified cache site discovered using her research methodology.
The Strategic Resource Recovery Initiative has exceeded all initial projections, Rebecca reported to the assembled officials. To date, we have successfully located and cataloged 847 previously unknown cache sites across 23 military installations. Total recovered asset value has reached $31.2 million, with an additional 200 sites pending verification. General Patricia Hendricks, the Pentagon's Deputy Chief of Staff for Logistics, studied the map with obvious satisfaction. Specialist Martinez, can you give us the operational readiness assessment for these recovered assets? Rebecca clicked to the next slide, showing detailed condition reports. 87% of recovered equipment is fully operational or requires only minor maintenance. 13% require moderate repair or refurbishment. Less than 2% has been classified as non-recoverable due to environmental damage. The statistics were remarkable, but what impressed the officials most was the systematic approach Rebecca had developed for locating the sites. What had started as academic research had evolved into a comprehensive intelligence methodology that was revolutionizing military resource management. The key breakthrough came from understanding historical logistics doctrine, Rebecca continued. Military planners have used consistent strategic principles for cache placement across multiple decades. By analyzing these patterns and correlating them with geographical data, we can predict probable cache locations with 78% accuracy. Colonel Harrison, now serving as director of the Strategic Resource Recovery Unit, added context to Rebecca's presentation. The methodology has been so successful that we're expanding operations to include international locations where U.S. forces have conducted long-term training operations. Preliminary assessments suggest significant resource recovery potential in Germany, Japan, and South Korea. But the most significant development wasn't just the recovery of forgotten equipment, it was the institutional change that Rebecca's discovery had triggered throughout the military. Perhaps more importantly, General Hendricks noted, this initiative has fundamentally changed how we approach long-term strategic planning. We're no longer just recovering old assets, we're implementing systematic cache placement for future operations. Rebecca nodded and clicked a map showing planned cache networks for the next decade. The new Strategic Reserve Initiative calls for establishing documented, GPS-tracked supply networks at all major training facilities. Unlike the previous ad hoc systems, these will be centrally managed with digital record-keeping and regular maintenance schedules. The transformation of military logistics thinking was remarkable, but for Rebecca, the most satisfying development was what had happened to her original squad members. Sergeant Morrison had been promoted to Staff Sergeant and was now leading cache recovery operations at Fort Benning. His team had located over 60 sites containing everything from Vietnam-era communications equipment to advanced night vision systems from the 1990s. Rodriguez had become the unit specialist in buried fuel cache recovery, developing techniques for safely extracting decades-old diesel and gasoline supplies that were still viable for emergency use. Her work had recovered enough fuel to power a mechanized battalion for weeks. Thompson had focused on medical supply recovery, cataloging field hospitals and emergency medical caches that had been established during major training exercises. Her discoveries have yielded surgical equipment, medications, and trauma supplies that exceeded the current inventory at several base hospitals. Williams and Kowalski had partnered to develop new search techniques using ground-penetrating radar and advanced metal detection systems. Their innovations have increased cache location accuracy by 35% and reduced excavation time by half. The human element has been as important as the technology, Rebecca explained to the Pentagon officials. Recovery operations require soldiers who can think creatively, adapt to unexpected situations, and work with incomplete information. The skills developed during emergency field operations translate directly to strategic resource recovery.
But the story's most significant impact wasn't measured in dollars or equipment counts. It was the change in military culture that Rebecca's discovery had inspired. "We've fundamentally altered how the military thinks about institutional memory," Colonel Harrison reported. "Instead of assuming that knowledge is automatically preserved through official channels, we now actively seek out informal information sources and historical perspectives that might reveal forgotten assets or capabilities." The Pentagon has established a Historical Resource Recovery Division, tasked with interviewing retired military personnel, analyzing historical documents, and investigating reports of forgotten supply sites. This systematic approach to recovering institutional knowledge has already yielded discoveries beyond physical cache sites. "We've recovered training methodologies, tactical innovations, and strategic concepts that were developed decades ago but never formally documented," General Hendricks explained. "In many cases, these forgotten approaches are more effective than current standard procedures." As Rebecca concluded her briefing, she reflected on how dramatically her life had changed since that morning when her squad mates had laughed at her. She was now a specialist in the newly created Military Intelligence Corps, working toward a doctorate in strategic resource management with full military funding, and leading a research team that was transforming how the world's largest military organization thought about logistics and planning. "Looking forward," she told the assembled officials, "our next phase involves international collaboration. Allied nations are requesting assistance in applying our methodology to their own training facilities and strategic reserves. We estimate that NATO countries collectively have thousands of undocumented cache sites that could be recovered using systematic historical analysis." The implications extended far beyond military applications. Rebecca's research methodology was being adapted by civilian agencies for disaster preparedness, with FEMA and state emergency management organizations using similar techniques to locate forgotten emergency supply stockpiles. After the briefing, as Rebecca packed up her presentation materials, General Hendricks approached her privately. "Specialist Martinez, I have to ask, when you started marking up that map for a training exercise, did you have any idea what you were going to unleash?" Rebecca smiled, remembering the morning when Kowalski had joked about her treasure map and Rodriguez had mocked her hieroglyphics. "No, ma'am," she replied honestly. "I was just trying to make sure my squad would be prepared for whatever happened out there. I never imagined that being prepared would mean discovering a forgotten network of strategic resources worth tens of millions of dollars." "What drove you to do all that research in the first place?" the general asked. Rebecca thought about the question carefully. "I suppose I didn't trust that other people had asked all the right questions. Everyone assumed that if something was important, it would be documented and remembered. But I kept wondering, what if it wasn't? What if there were gaps in our knowledge that nobody had thought to look for?" General Hendricks nodded approvingly. "That kind of thinking is exactly what we need more of in the military. The willingness to question assumptions and look for information that others have overlooked." As Rebecca left the Pentagon that evening, she carried with her orders for the next phase of strategic resource recovery operations, a 2-year assignment to develop cache location methodologies for U.S. installations worldwide. Her team would include her original squad members, now specialists in their own right, and they would be working with allied militaries to share techniques and coordinate recovery efforts. The girl who had been mocked for her carefully researched map had become one of the military's leading experts on strategic resource management. More importantly, her discovery had changed how the entire defense establishment thought about the relationship between historical knowledge and current operational capability.
Sometimes the most important discoveries come from people who refuse to accept that the obvious answer is the complete answer. Rebecca Martinez had looked at a standard military training exercise and asked a simple question: what if there's more here than anyone realizes? The answer had transformed not just her own career, but the way the world's most powerful military force approached strategic planning and resource management. And it all started with a map that everyone thought was covered in meaningless squiggles until someone took the time to understand what those squiggles really meant. 5 years after the Whiskey Mountain discovery, Rebecca Martinez, now Captain Martinez, stood on the observation deck of a research vessel anchored off the coast of Okinawa, Japan. Her mission had evolved far beyond recovering forgotten American supply caches.
The Strategic Resource Recovery Initiative had become an international operation, with 12 allied nations participating in what military historians were calling the largest archaeological recovery effort in modern history. "Captain, we've got confirmation on the underwater cache site," reported Lieutenant Sarah Chen, Rebecca's new operations officer, who had joined the team after graduating top of her class from the Naval War College. "Sonar indicates a sealed container approximately 30 feet below the surface, consistent with the 1960s amphibious training protocols you identified." Rebecca studied the underwater survey data on her tablet. The cache site they were investigating had been established during joint U.S.-Japanese amphibious warfare exercises in 1967, then forgotten when the training area was redesignated for civilian use. According to Rebecca's research, it should contain specialized diving equipment and underwater demolition supplies that were far more advanced than anything available to civilian salvage operations. "What's the condition assessment?" Rebecca asked. "The container appears intact," Chen replied. "No visible corrosion or structural damage. The engineers estimate a 90% probability that the contents are recoverable." This was typical of what had become routine operations for Rebecca's expanded team. What had started as a simple methodology for finding buried supply caches had evolved into a comprehensive system for locating and recovering lost military assets from land, sea, and even underground installations that had been sealed and forgotten decades earlier. The international implications had grown beyond anything the Pentagon had initially envisioned. When Rebecca's team began working with NATO allies, they discovered that every major military power had similar networks of forgotten resources scattered across their territories and former territories worldwide. The British Royal Navy alone has identified over 400 potential cache sites, Rebecca explained to a documentary crew that was filming the recovery operation. Many date back to World War II preparations for potential German invasion. The equipment includes everything from coastal artillery pieces to communication systems that were considered state-of-the-art in the 1940s. But the most remarkable discovery had come not from military sources, but from an unexpected collaboration with academic historians and archaeologists. Rebecca's systematic approach to analyzing historical documents and correlating them with geographical data had proven equally effective for locating non-military historical artifacts of immense cultural and scientific value. "We've inadvertently become treasure hunters," Rebecca admitted to Chen as they watched the dive team prepare to investigate the underwater cache. "But we're hunting for treasures that governments and militaries lost track of, rather than treasures that were deliberately hidden." The dive team's success with the Okinawa cache site had been typical of their expanded operations. Inside the sealed container, they found not only the expected diving equipment, but also prototype underwater cameras that had been developed specifically for military reconnaissance. The cameras were decades ahead of civilian technology from the same period and included features that weren't incorporated into commercial equipment until the 1990s. This raises fascinating questions about technology transfer between military and civilian sectors, noted Dr. James Patterson, a military historian who had joined Rebecca's team as a consultant. "Many innovations that we assume developed gradually in the private sector actually existed in classified military applications decades earlier." The technological discoveries had practical implications beyond historical interest. Several pieces of recovered equipment had proven superior to modern equivalents in specific applications. A communication system recovered from a cache in Germany, for example, was more resistant to electromagnetic interference than current military radios, leading to a program to reverse engineer and modernize the design. "We're not just recovering the past," Rebecca explained to the documentary crew. "We're discovering forgotten solutions to current problems." The success of the international program had attracted attention from unexpected quarters. The United Nations had requested Rebecca's assistance in locating supply caches that might contain evidence of war crimes or human rights violations from past conflicts. Several African nations had asked for help finding medical supplies and humanitarian aid that had been pre-positioned during previous crises that never distributed due to political instability. The methodology works for any situation where resources were systematically placed and then forgotten due to institutional changes, Rebecca had explained to the UN representatives. "Whether it's military supplies, humanitarian aid, or scientific equipment, the principles of systematic historical analysis and geographical correlation remain the same." The expansion into humanitarian applications had been personally rewarding for Rebecca, but it had also revealed the darker side of institutional memory loss. In Rwanda, her team had located medical supplies that could have saved lives during the 1994 genocide, but had remained buried and forgotten due to bureaucratic confusion. In Bosnia, they found weapons caches that had been established by various factions during the 1990s conflict and never properly secured or destroyed. Every cache we locate, Rebecca reflects. Sometimes it's a story of remarkable foresight and preparation. Sometimes it's a story of missed opportunities and institutional failure. But every story teaches us something about how organizations preserve or lose critical knowledge. The personal cost of the expanded mission had been significant. Rebecca's marriage to a fellow officer had ended when his career progression couldn't accommodate her increasingly frequent international assignments. Her relationship with her parents had become strained when they struggled to understand why she was spending months at a time in remote locations around the world, digging up equipment that probably should have stayed buried. But the professional rewards had been extraordinary. Rebecca was now recognized as one of the world's leading experts in strategic resource recovery, with academic credentials that included a completed doctorate, 3 published books, and consultant positions with governments and international organizations worldwide. The hardest part isn't the physical challenge of locating and recovering the caches, Rebecca told Chen as they reviewed the day's successful operation. It's convincing people that the effort is worthwhile. There's always someone who asks why we're spending time and money recovering old equipment instead of buying new gear.
Chen nodded understanding. She had faced similar questions from family and friends who couldn't understand why a brilliant young officer would choose to spend her career playing in the dirt instead of pursuing traditional command positions. But then we find something like today's cache, Rebecca continued, and remember that we're not just recovering equipment, we're recovering knowledge, capabilities, and perspectives that took decades to develop and would be incredibly expensive to recreate. The underwater cache had yielded not just diving equipment, but also detailed operational manuals that documented amphibious warfare techniques that were no longer taught in current military schools. The manuals contained innovations in underwater navigation, small unit tactics, and equipment modification that had been developed through years of practical experience, then lost when the institutional knowledge wasn't properly transferred to subsequent generations of soldiers and sailors. "This is why the work matters," Rebecca said, holding up one of the recovered manuals. "This document represents thousands of hours of training, experimentation, and refinement by some of the best military minds of their generation. Without systematic recovery efforts, this knowledge would be lost forever." As the research vessel headed back to port, Rebecca began planning the next phase of operations. Her team had received requests from 8 different countries to investigate potential cache sites, and preliminary research had identified over 300 locations worldwide that showed promise for significant recoveries. The girl who had started with a carefully annotated map for a training exercise had become the leader of a global operation that was reshaping how governments, militaries, and international organizations thought about institutional memory and strategic resource management. "You know what's funny?" Rebecca said to Chen as they watched the sunset over the Pacific. "Everyone still calls it treasure hunting, but the real treasure isn't the equipment we recover. It's the proof that careful research and systematic thinking can uncover extraordinary resources that everyone assumed were gone forever." The impact of Rebecca's discovery had extended far beyond military applications. Her research methodology was being taught in business schools as a case study in institutional knowledge management. Technology companies were using similar approaches to locate and recover innovative projects that had been abandoned or forgotten during corporate reorganizations. Even archaeological expeditions were applying her techniques to identify sites that might contain artifacts of historical significance. The transformation from a mocked soldier with a peculiar map to an internationally recognized expert in strategic resource recovery had taken 5 years. But the principles that drove her success had remained constant: thorough research, systematic analysis, and the willingness to question assumptions that everyone else accepted without investigation.
As Captain Rebecca Martinez prepared for her next mission, investigating reports of forgotten supply networks in the mountains of Afghanistan, she carried with her the same curiosity and attention to detail that had marked her first training exercise in the Whiskey Mountains. The only difference was that now, when she marked symbols on her maps, military commanders around the world pay very close attention to what those symbols might reveal. 3 months later, Rebecca found herself in a forward operating base in the Hindu Kush Mountains, staring at satellite imagery that she'd only read about in classified briefings. The Afghanistan assignment had begun as a routine investigation into Soviet-era supply caches from the 1980s, but had evolved into something far more complex and politically sensitive. "Captain, we've got a problem," announced Major Derek Sullivan, the base commander who had been assigned to oversee Rebecca's operations. "Local intelligence sources are reporting that some of these cache sites you've identified contain more than just military supplies." Rebecca looked up from her analysis workstation, where she'd been correlating Soviet military documents with current topographical surveys. "What kind of additional materials?" "Documents, maps, communication logs," Sullivan replied grimly. "Potentially sensitive intelligence about operations that both governments would prefer remained classified." The implications were staggering. Rebecca's systematic approach to cache recovery had been so successful that it was now uncovering evidence of military operations that multiple nations had spent decades trying to forget. The Afghanistan caches weren't just forgotten supply drops. They were time capsules containing proof of covert operations, intelligence networks, and strategic decisions that could embarrass or compromise current diplomatic relationships. "Sir, are you asking me to limit my investigation to avoid recovering inconvenient historical evidence?" Rebecca asked carefully. Sullivan was quiet for a long moment, studying the satellite imagery spread across Rebecca's workstation. "I'm asking you to understand that some discoveries might have consequences beyond academic or military interest." But Rebecca had encountered similar situations before. In Eastern Europe, her team had located caches containing evidence of Cold War intelligence operations that both NATO and former Warsaw Pact countries preferred to keep secret. In Southeast Asia, they'd found supplies that revealed details about covert support for various factions during regional conflicts. "Major, with respect, hiding from historical truth doesn't make that truth disappear. If anything, systematic recovery and documentation helps ensure that sensitive materials are handled properly, rather than discovered accidentally by unauthorized parties." Sullivan nodded slowly. "That's actually why Command approved this mission. Better to have professionals locate and secure these sites than risk having them found by insurgent groups or foreign intelligence services." The conversation was interrupted by Rebecca's communications specialist, Staff Sergeant Maria Gonzalez, who had joined the team after demonstrating exceptional skill at decoding Cold War-era radio protocols. "Captain, we've intercepted local radio chatter about unusual activity near Grid Square 47 Alpha," Gonzalez reported. "Multiple sources confirm that unidentified personnel have been excavating in the area over the past week." Rebecca checked her maps. Grid Square 47 Alpha contained 3 potential cache sites she'd identified based on Soviet logistics documents from 1987. If unauthorized parties were already investigating the area, it meant her research was accurate enough that others were using similar methodologies to locate the same sites. "What's our intelligence assessment of who might be conducting unauthorized excavation?" Rebecca asked. "Could be anyone from treasure hunters to foreign intelligence operatives," Sullivan replied. "The region has attracted attention from multiple parties interested in Cold War artifacts. Some are legitimate archaeological expeditions, others are definitely not." Rebecca realized that her success in developing cache location techniques had created an unexpected security challenge. If her methodology could be reverse-engineered or stolen, it could enable hostile parties to locate sensitive sites throughout regions where the United States had conducted military operations. "Major, I recommend we accelerate our timeline and prioritize the most sensitive locations," Rebecca suggested. "If there are other parties using similar techniques, we need to secure critical sites before they can be compromised." The next week involved the most challenging operations Rebecca had ever conducted. Working with Special Forces teams, her unit located and secured 7 cache sites in disputed territory, recovering not only military supplies but also intelligence documents that provided insight into Soviet strategic thinking during their Afghanistan occupation. The documentation is remarkable, noted Dr. Elena Petrov, a Russian military historian who had been assigned to Rebecca's team as part of an unprecedented U.S.-Russian cooperation agreement. These files contain operational assessments and strategic analyses that were never included in official Soviet military records. The cooperation with Russian historians had been one of the most surprising developments in Rebecca's career. When the Strategic Resource Recovery Initiative had expanded internationally, several former adversary nations had requested assistance in locating and securing their own forgotten military assets. The result was a series of joint operations that would have been unthinkable during the Cold War. "It's ironic," Rebecca observed to Dr. Petrov as they examined Soviet-era maps that showed remarkable similarity to her own analytical techniques. "We're using the same systematic approach to historical research that your military planners used 40 years ago. The principles of strategic resource placement haven't changed much across different political systems." Dr. Petrov smiled. "Perhaps this suggests that certain military truths transcend ideological boundaries. The need for secure supply lines, strategic depth, and resource redundancy appears to be universal." The philosophical implications of their work had become as significant as the practical results. Rebecca's research was demonstrating that military organizations across different cultures and time periods had developed remarkably similar solutions to strategic challenges. The cache networks they were recovering revealed common patterns of military thinking that suggested universal principles of warfare and logistics. "We're not just recovering forgotten supplies," Rebecca explained to a visiting delegation of NATO military attaché. "We're documenting the evolution of military strategy across multiple generations and political systems." The cache sites serve as archaeological evidence of how different armies approached the same fundamental challenges. The delegation's visit had been prompted by a discovery that had stunned military historians worldwide. In a remote valley near the Pakistan border, Rebecca's team had located a cache site that contained supplies from 3 different armies: Soviet forces from the 1980s, British forces from colonial-era operations in the early 1900s, and even equipment that appeared to date from Alexander the Great's campaign through the region in 330 BCE. The site appears to have been used as a strategic supply point for over 2,000 years, Rebecca reported to the delegation. Each successive military force recognized the same geographic advantages and utilized the location for resource storage. The layered archaeological evidence provides unprecedented insight into the continuity of military strategic thinking across vastly different historical periods. The discovery had attracted attention from academic institutions worldwide. Oxford University had requested permission to establish a joint archaeological expedition with Rebecca's team. The Smithsonian Institution was planning a major exhibition based on their recoveries. Even the Vatican had expressed interest, as some of the recovered documents contained references to Crusader-era military operations in the region. "We've accidentally become military archaeologists," Rebecca told Major Sullivan as they reviewed the international requests for cooperation and access to their discoveries. "What started as a practical exercise in resource recovery has evolved into one of the most significant military history research projects in modern times." But the success had created new challenges beyond political sensitivities and international cooperation. Rebecca's team was now receiving hundreds of requests from governments, academic institutions, and private organizations seeking assistance with their own historical recovery projects. The demand far exceeded their capacity, and the military was struggling to balance operational requirements with the scientific and diplomatic opportunities that Rebecca's work had created. "Captain, I've received authorization to expand your unit to battalion strength," Sullivan announced during a morning briefing. "Command recognizes that strategic resource recovery has become strategically significant enough to warrant major resource allocation." The expansion would mean recruiting and training hundreds of soldiers in Rebecca's methodology, establishing permanent research facilities at multiple locations worldwide, and coordinating with international partners on a scale that would make the operation one of the largest military research initiatives since the Manhattan Project. "What's our timeline for the expansion?" Rebecca asked. 18 months for full operational capability," Sullivan replied. "But there's one catch. Command wants you to develop a comprehensive training curriculum that can be replicated at military academies worldwide. They want strategic resource recovery to become a standard military occupation specialty." Rebecca realized that her accidental discovery in the Whiskey Mountains was about to become a permanent part of military education and operations. Future soldiers would study her techniques in the same way they studied artillery tactics or communications protocols. Her annotated map, which had once been dismissed as meaningless squiggles, would become the foundation for an entirely new military discipline. "There's something poetic about this," Rebecca reflected as she began sketching out the training curriculum structure. "We started by recovering forgotten knowledge from the past, and now we're creating new knowledge for the future. The cache sites we're investigating today will eventually become historical artifacts that future researchers will study to understand how we approached strategic challenges." As Rebecca prepared to return to the United States to begin developing the expanded Strategic Resource Recovery Program, she received an unexpected message from her former squadmate, now Sergeant First Class Danny Kowalski. "Hey Martinez," the message read, "I saw your interview on that documentary about the Afghanistan discoveries. Mom wants to know if you're still carrying around that crazy map with all the symbols on it. Also, the guys from our old unit want to know if you're hiring. Turns out treasure hunting beats regular Army life by a pretty wide margin." Rebecca smiled as she read the message. 5 years later, the same soldiers who had joked about her treasure map were requesting assignments to her unit. The map itself was now displayed in the Pentagon's Museum of Military History, with a placard describing it as the document that revolutionized strategic resource recovery operations worldwide. But for Rebecca, the most satisfying aspect of her success wasn't the recognition or the career advancement. It was the knowledge that her willingness to question assumptions and conduct thorough research had fundamentally changed how the military thought about the relationship between historical knowledge and current capabilities. "Every cache we recover teaches us something about preparation, foresight, and the importance of systematic thinking," Rebecca had told the documentary crew during filming. "But more importantly, every recovery demonstrates that valuable resources are often hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone with the patience and methodology to look for them properly." The girl who had been mocked for over-preparing for a training exercise had become the architect of a global military discipline that was reshaping how armed forces worldwide approached strategic planning, historical research, and international cooperation. And she was just getting started. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.